Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, spring training workouts are underway. We talk about player arrivals, the Frankie Montas injury, Steve Cohen's quotes, and much more. So subscribe to the Mets Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. We have a lot to get through today, but before we do, please subscribe to the Mets Pod, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. And also, please leave us a review. If you do, leave a question with that review. You'll hear a lot of those mailbag questions today on the second half of the show. And of course, one last reminder here, the Mets Pod will be in Port St. Lucie for a live show. That is this Saturday before the first spring training game at Clover Park. We will be set up right outside the main gate. The show starts at 11 a.m. Please stop by if you're there to hang out. We have a special guest, by the way. That is former Mets manager Terry Collins. He'll be joining us. We'll be doing a giveaway on site, 2 Mets Pod Shea Stadium neon signed t-shirts. These were from our amazing collab we did a little while ago with our friend Dan Abrams. You know him as Athlete Logos. Only a few were made. They're not available for sale anywhere, but 2 lucky winners will get them at our live show before the game. That is this Saturday, outside Clover Park at 11 a.m. All right, Joe, let's jump right into it. We have player arrivals. Unfortunately, we have our first spring training injury. That's just how it goes. You got to be built up to it by now. But it is nice to see Juan Soto in a Mets gear for the first time, and it's nice to see Pete Alonso back in Mets gear.
It's just great that baseball's back, seeing guys in uniform, seeing guys hitting baseballs, seeing guys throwing baseballs into catcher's mitts. This is what we live for, so I'm glad to be back, and, as you just mentioned, cannot wait to be in Port St. Lucie here in a couple days.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. And the vibes around spring training, if you haven't been, are truly special. No matter what the expectations are going into the year, I think this year things are cranked up a couple notches. We're going to talk about Steve Cohen's meeting with the media, and he's been all over the place. He did meet at the Apple with Howie Rose. He obviously has spoken with reporters, so we'll jump into all of that. I think his expectations, justifiably, after the checks he's written, are pretty high as well. But unfortunately, Joe, one of those checks and the new additions in Frankie Montas, he's going to be shut down a little bit with a lat injury. And when I say a little bit, this is one that could extend a couple of months here, Joe. With lat injuries, especially with pitchers, you kind of are where you are. It's not something that you can push. I would almost liken it to an upper body equivalent of a soft tissue, whether it's a hamstring, whether it's a quad. Like, you got to be really, really delicate with the lat muscle, especially for a pitcher, Joe. And right away, nothing we're not used to, the Mets pitching depth will be tested, although this is why David Stearns has established that pitching depth.
The injury to Frankie Montas here, based on some recent history, you really have to expect that he will not be available for the next 3 to 3.5 months. I know a lot of it is 6 to 8 weeks, but that 6 to 8 weeks, all that is just he's shut down from throwing. And then after the 6 to 8 week time frame, they'll determine, is he ready to start throwing yet? And if so, he has to build up a throwing program. And then from the throwing program, he essentially needs to have another spring training, which is roughly 5 to 6 weeks. So if you just put those numbers on top of each other, you're looking at an extended absence for Frankie Montas. And while unfortunate, that is why the Mets built up this pitching depth that they did. This is opportunity for Paul Blackburn, who is getting built up with the thought of being ready for opening day, coming off of the spinal fluid leak that he had, at the end of last year and into the offseason. Griffin Canning, who the Mets signed to a 1-year deal. And we joked about this in our group text. Feels like every year there's a spring training pitcher injury, and what that means is Tyler McGill gets another stab in the rotation. So the Mets have some depth pieces that are going to be able to compete for the last couple spots of the rotation, and ultimately you have to look at it as an opportunity for those guys.
Yeah, and that's why you have these guys brought in, because, listen, I think, the Met fan, understandably, especially the pre-David Stearns era, is accustomed to oh, here we go. It begins right away. And I think if you really keep an eye across baseball, Joe, it feels like almost every team, pitching is such an unnatural thing to do that it is such a difficult thing to ramp up for after the layoff. And everybody trains differently in the offseason. Some guys just need to shut down and rest. I mean, look at all the innings a guy like Sean Manaea threw last year. And then, we've heard a lot from Edwin Diaz so far that this time last year, because of the rehab from his lower body injury, he did not get to do his typical throwing program going into spring training that he likes to do, and got to get back to that this year, where it almost gives him a quicker start into spring training where he can get more comfortable. So everybody's different. There's no way around it. Like, the injury to Montas stinks. He's part of this rotation, especially the back end where they want to get a lot of innings from a guy like that and feel like they can maximize his stuff. But number one, it feels like Tyler McGill is equipped and ready to roll in this scenario every single year now for multiple years. You and I specifically go to bat for Griffin Canning. It kind of felt like a bit we did on the show, but it's not a bit. We're really hoping Griffin Canning can help out with this team. I guess, though, the elephant in the room that I have to bring up, Joe, and the Mets haven't really had much contact in bringing him back, but what do you think of Jose Quintana in all of this? Because there's the part of me that looks at this and goes, I want to see what you establish this depth all offseason to see what they have, right? I just because Montas gets hurt, and somebody was going to get hurt. Went through this with Senga last year. It doesn't mean that, oh God, now we have to press pull the emergency lever. No, you have McGill, you have Canning, you have guys on this roster that could be starters for a reason. But I will say this, Joe, there's the other side of me that, not only as a Jose Quintana fan, I feel like bringing him in, there is no downside. It's not expensive. If he has nothing in the tank, you kind of just move on from him being in your rotation. And Quintana, as we talked about on the last show, was incredible for this team the last, 6 weeks of the season or whatever it was, really, for obviously the postseason is what I'm talking about. What are your thoughts surrounding Quintana right now, Joe, who somehow still doesn't have a job, which is unbelievable?
It is surprising he doesn't have a job. I look at Quintana and I look at Andrew Heaney, who is also still hanging out there as a free agent, as two guys that I think would be worthwhile for the Mets to make a call to. While there are things I like about Paul Blackburn, he's ultimately a number 5 type of starter. While there are things that I think are interesting about Griffin Canning, and his 2023, I think, was a little bit of a better sign of what you can hope for out of him. He is coming off a year where he was literally the worst starting pitcher in baseball. So the expectations are naturally a little lower there. And Tyler McGill is equipped for this situation, as you mentioned, but this is now the 3rd or 4th opportunity to find his way into the rotation due to injury. And it's been an up and down road for McGill. There's no way around that. And every year we get mailbag questions and we talk about, when is Tyler McGill getting moved to the bullpen? And that's obviously not in the cards right now. Even though I don't know it would be a significant upgrade from what they currently have, I would not be opposed to a Quintana or Andrew Heaney, who I think are guys that you can look at and say, they're going to throw you 150 innings.
Right.
And the Mets could use some of that stability on the back end of the rotation, which I know it's crazy to say, but Frankie Montas, coming off the amount of innings that he threw in 2024, he was almost looked at as that back end guy who could give some innings. So definitely would call Quintana, definitely would call Andrew Heaney. And if the price is right, and that's important, I know people don't want to hear it. Everyone just knows Steve Cohen is worth $20 billion. So money should be no object anytime ever. But now that they are back into the Cohen tax, remember, everything is 110% of every dollar. So if you give Jose Quintana $6 million, you're paying him more like $13 million if you get, and down the line. So just something that they have to consider if the investment is worth it. But at this point, I'd be interested in getting some innings in the room.
The glass half full outlook to me, that's just funny, right? I'm not sitting here saying losing Frankie Montas is fine. That's not the point at all. But it is funny to me, Joe, that if you just blind read these numbers, 16 games last year, 15 of the appearances were starts, 4.04 ERA, struck out 10.5 over 9. You'd be like, man, I think I'd love that from Frankie Montas this year. That was Tyler McGill's numbers last year. So that's why it's just funny to me that I'd rather Frankie Montas be healthy and in this rotation. But I do think that's probably their line of thinking, Joe, where it's, we don't need, I think if you had one more injury, Heaney and Quintana
Oh,
would
yeah.
come into a top of the conversation, and this can happen. It's baseball and it's pitching. But I do think there is a comfort level with you're playing the numbers with arms. This is definitely a Stearns approach. I think the thought process is, and Paul Blackburn, you brought this up, is a little difficult to project because of the injury, and we just don't have a concrete timeline of when he'll be himself again. But you'd like to think one of McGill, Canning, or Blackburn can fill the void as a number 5 for a couple months of your season. Like, you're playing the numbers of one of those three being capable of filling that role.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. If this was Sean Manaea going down for an extended period of time or Kodai Senga going down again for an extended period of time, the conversation might be a little different. The Mets signed Frankie Montas to be a back-end starter, so you're replacing a back-end starter with a different back-end starter that maybe just fans are not as excited about, the potential of. But either way, the Mets season, if it's defined by losing Frankie Montas, then this team was simply just not built the way we thought it was.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, let's get into some of the arrivals. The most notable outside of Juan Soto is probably the return of Pete Alonso, Joe, who, I mean, nothing shocking from hearing from Pete speaking to the media, how much he loves the Mets organization. He's obviously very open to being here beyond the short-term deal that he's signed. And yes, it's a 2-year deal, but it has the opt-out after one. He had kind of a funny moment where they asked him if contract negotiations were exhausting when Steve Cohen brought that up in Amazing Day, and Pete was like, not for me. So I think the bottom line is just seeing Alonso not only written into this lineup, but in spring training and camp on time, Joe, is a really, really good feeling. Soto actually mentioned Pete right away, too, when they were talking to him in his opening presser as well. It just feels like we always thought this was the best for both sides because Pete, unfortunately, has to reestablish his market again. And for the Mets, it's such a comfort spot where I'm actually pleasantly surprised that there is just no awkwardness. Like, this is where Pete was meant to be. This is a comfortable place for him. And now he's hitting in a lineup that somehow got even better.
I don't know about you, Connor, but I'm stoked. I mean, Pete Alonso said that quite a few times. He loves the word stoked. But what stood out to me was this just felt like Pete Alonso was back for a regular spring training.
It didn't feel like anything happened in the offseason.
It didn't feel like this whole dramatic situation that we went through over the last 3 months. And, we were fielding questions about how hurt his feelings are going to be. Who do the Mets want him? Does he want the Mets? Every possible thing went through our brains. And now he's there. And it just feels like, oh, yeah, Pete Alonso just back with the Mets the way it should be, the way it always, you and I thought would ultimately work out. And now we get to follow his chase to become the Mets all-time home run leader this season. And I'm very excited to see him in this lineup with Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor and Vientos and Nimmo and down the line. So all in all, a great thing that the Mets were able to get that done when they did. And it seems like Pete Alonso has showed up as a happy Met ready to play ball.
And obviously Juan Soto pretty happy, a nice payday for him in this offseason. But seeing Juan Soto in Mets gear, I think it's one of those situations, right, where yes, these are major leaguers, but at the end of the day, they're all still different tiers of major leaguers, Joe. It feels like the aura and just feel of Juan Soto being on the field for the Mets I don't think it's fully sunk in yet. You're always waiting for that first moment, whether it's even a home run at spring training and then how it carries into the regular season. But man, there's just something different about there's star power on the field for the Mets in Port St. Lucie. And I think that can't be denied. It's, I don't think we take Lindor for granted, but Lindor has that star talent where just his presence being there, obviously Pete with the home run hitting ability, but now adding Juan Soto into this equation, I think it raises the stakes of everybody in Port St. Lucie. Like, when you see that guy on your side, you're going, there's no reason we can't be the best team in baseball and challenge to win for a World Series, where we haven't even watched a spring training game, let alone a regular season game here, Joe. But I think there is something to the presence of that caliber player being in your organization.
Connor, I think we spend a lot of time talking about the deficiencies of teams, right? And we go through the Mets roster and where they can improve here, where they could be better there. And I think you often overlook the star power that is Juan Soto. And watching him take batting practice on social media, I can't wait to be down in Port St. Lucie and see that in person from, behind home plate, from some view that's much more much better to like hear the sound off the bat, because it's different with a player like that. And when he walked in and Carlos Mendoza handed him that beautiful spring training hat that I love personally, it felt right. And a lot of times when the Mets have brought in free agents over the last couple of years, it's, Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander. It was almost like, I have to get used to these guys being in a Mets uniform, Mets gear. Juan Soto walks in and it's just like, it feels like this is where he was always meant to be. He just feels like a Met day one. You see him joking around with everyone. Like, this is the type of personality that just blends into a clubhouse instantly. And part of that is that aura and that star quality. Is he walks in the room and he garners everybody's attention. And by all accounts, we're a couple days in, but it sure looks like Juan Soto is getting along with everybody swimmingly.
I agree. There are moments where you look at like Verlander and Scherzer are great call outs, especially how long they played, and Scherzer specifically against the Mets, where it's just weird for a while and you really don't get used to it until maybe, I would say, May or June, where you're like, okay, this guy's on the Mets and like he's a Met now. And I don't feel that way with Soto at all when I see him in Mets gear. And maybe it's because he is still so young that the likely reality is Juan Soto will be remembered as a New York Met. And it's amazing when you say that because of how much he's accomplished already and how great of a player he is. But because of his age and the contract, I can't recall a time where I felt like I didn't feel like this about Lindor. And I was so excited when they got Lindor, but it felt a little weird because I just remembered Cleveland Lindor for so long. And now he's had Mets moments where I don't look at it like that, but I don't even need the moment from Juan Soto yet. Maybe the closest is Beltran, but he had, we always talk about how he was an incredible Met, but there was some moments where, you're obviously upset with how things went, but also that Beltran played for so many teams in his career for how great of a player he was. Great players like that don't usually play for that many clubs. You're right. There is something very natural about Juan Soto in orange and blue.
Beltran, interestingly, it was a lot of teams after the Mets. Like,
yes,
that's where he kind of cycled through some teams. And Soto has secretly been on a few teams, right? Like, he was on the Nationals, and he got traded to the Padres, and he got traded to the Yankees, and he signed with the Mets. But the best part of this all, Connor, exactly as you said it, unless something transpires, Juan Soto is going to be spending the rest of his professional career as a New York Met. And that is something that everybody listening should be very excited that gets to start here in 2025.
Yeah, and somebody that had a lot to do with this move is Steve Cohen, who spoke about the attendance last year. The Mets were in the bottom half, more middle of the pack, but I think they were around 18th for overall attendance in baseball last year. Cohen was really honest about it. He said, I didn't like it. It really bothered me. It sounds like ticket sales are trending much more positively for 2025. I think that's what happens when you have a top of the lineup that is Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto, Mark Vientos, Pete Alonso. That goes a long way. It also happens when your team was 2 games away from making the World Series unexpectedly last year. But the atmosphere around the ballpark, I think, will be much different this year, Joe. I think it's also tough, I'll say this, when you start the way the Mets did, because everybody is fearful of buying back in. I mean, there's a point when you have that kind of start to the year where you're in the middle of May and you're like, well, I have no expectations anymore for the season. And I don't know what my commitment level is going to be in terms of living and dying with every moment of this team. So I think that was why it was a little bit of an anomaly. Like, I don't think the attendance typically will be that low. The Mets just had such a tough start to the year, but I think this year things will be much different. I think the ballpark atmosphere is going to be insane because it's not just that the Mets are a good team. You also need to be exciting to watch. And they have supplemented this roster with guys that people want to go, like, you want to go watch Jesse Winker kind of stir things up a little bit, right? Like, you want to watch, obviously, Francisco Alvarez take the next step. You love seeing Sean Manaea back on the mound. Kodai Senga, hopefully healthy for this season. It's not just Edwin Diaz, Juan Soto, Francisco Lindor, and Pete Alonso. I think what people loved about the Mets last year were not only that they were a good team at the end of the day, but they were probably the most entertaining team in baseball.
The one thing from the attendance, because this is a very touchy subject, because you're dealing with telling fans how to spend their money and spend their time and
it's not
all of
cheap.
that. And it is not cheap to go. Trust me, I go to my share of games. I could go to more theoretically, but I go to my share, and I know it is an expensive adventure for you to take, especially if you're taking a family. Like if you're a family of 4 or a family of 5, it gets real pricey really quick. But the one thing about the attendance, the only time that I really felt bothered by it, I guess, as I was watching, and Steve actually made reference to this, was the National Series in September when the Mets were in the middle of the pennant race. And yes, it's during the week and there's school, and Citi Field sometimes it's not the most convenient place to get to if you don't live really in the city. So I get it to a degree, but it's like, man, they're in the middle of the pennant race. Let's jam pack this place, because when that place is jam packed, there is nothing like Citi Field. And I believe that things will be better in 2025 from that standpoint. As you mentioned, not only did they get off to a slow start, they more or less told us without telling us that this past year was supposed to be a transition year of sorts.
Yeah, well, Max Scherzer said it really loudly.
Yeah, Max made it clear as day, and then their offseason activity was not pursuing top-level things. They tried for Yamamoto, but they didn't land him, obviously. So the expectations were low, and they got off to a bad start. So I think that it took a while for fans to want to buy in. If ticket sales don't take a jump this year and attendance doesn't take a jump and excitement at the ballpark doesn't take a jump after making the National League Championship Series and being, as you said, 2 wins away from the World Series, signing Juan Soto, keeping Pete Alonso, keeping Sean Manaea, adding the different pieces that they did on the roster, then I would really just want to know, what do you have to do to fill up this ballpark?
Yeah, let's see the team win consistently and track the attendance from there. If that doesn't do it, then it's an infrastructure problem to me. And when I say infrastructure, that ranges from pricing for families, like you said, getting to the ballpark and obviously out of the ballpark. And honestly, it's something that they're going to work on in the future is having things around the ballpark outside of the stadium that maybe attract. One thing I think the Mets don't get, and maybe this is ignorant of me to say, but I view this like, I'm a big New York Rangers and Knicks fan. The Garden, which is utterly ridiculous to go to any game, by the way, for anyone, not just like even for really well-off people. It's a tourist attraction. And location is a big part of that, of course. But when people come to New York City, there's a lot of tourists that just go, I'm just going to go to a Knicks game, or I'm just going to go to a Rangers game. And that boosts attendance even when the team's not very good. In Queens, like, you don't get that bonus. Like when people go to Vegas now, and I've done this as well, people go to a Golden Knights game. It's like, I'm in Vegas, I'll go see the Golden Knights, because you could just basically walk to the arena. So the Mets don't get that kind of bonus. So that means you need to build the attendance specifically with your fan base. There's nothing wrong with that. There's millions of organizations. Most organizations operate that way, but the Mets don't have that New York advantage that some other organizations, not all New York organizations, but some do. So that'll be, and that's, going to be on them to kind of figure that out, Joe. But I think the most important thing is that they have a really, really good, expensive team that's the number one aspect to get people to come to the ballpark.
For sure. And as you mentioned, winning is what's going to bring fans to the ballpark. And I couldn't agree with that more. And the thing that stood out for me from Steve Cohen's meeting with the media earlier today was he put a playoff mandate on this thing. And
How could you not?
I mean, I understand, like, it feels like, duh, Captain Obvious based on everything you did. But if you listen to him over the years, of course, he said that I want to win the World Series in 3 to 5 years thing. And that didn't exactly, this is year 5, so it still could work out, but he's in his last year of that. But his expectation have been, we hope to make the playoffs. We'd like to be contend for the playoffs. This is the first time where Steve Cohen is sort of putting his foot down and saying, this is a make the playoff season. And obviously you want to go further and deeper, but you need to get in the dance and then you take it from there. And I think that was my big takeaway, is Steve Cohen really wants this team to take that next step to being that sustainable year-over-year winner.
Right. And the Mets in 2022, pretty decent team. They were 6th in attendance. So the proof is in the pudding. Like, if you consistently win games, people are going to go to the ballpark. They were literally 6th. So I don't think the Mets will have a problem with that this year. I'm excited to be at the ballpark a lot, and I know the atmosphere is going to be amazing. You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's jump into the mailbag for today. I want to start with the spring training double shot here. These are both 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts, so thank you to first Platoon Network. Long-time, first-time mailbag question coming off a magical NLCS run and landing Soto in free agency. This feels like the year for me to cross a visit to Mets spring training off my bucket list. When would you say is the best part of spring training to make the trip, and any other recommendation or do's and don'ts you have for me? The second part is from Jack Burden 1008. I'm going to be in St. Lucie this spring for the first time ever. I've never been to a spring training game. Any recommendations about what to do while I'm there? I'm naturally going to catch a game or two, but what else should a Mets fan do? I'm open to any recommendations, places to eat, things to see, what to do while in the area. Now, Joe, I've only been once. That was last year. I had a great time. Clover Park was phenomenal. You've been many, many times over the years. So how would you answer? I like the do's and don'ts. Like, can you walk into some trouble in Port St. Lucie?
It's a town where I think, drive the speed limit. That's probably a really good starting point. That would be a good don't. But when I look at Port St. Lucie, it's evolved a lot. So I went a lot when I was younger, and then there was a long gap in which I didn't go. And it has evolved a lot from when I would go almost every year. At that time, it was kind of like, there's a bunch of chain restaurants and the Mets, and then there's Duffy's, which go to Duffy's. Everyone should just make a stop at Duffy's your first time in Port St. Lucie, because obviously it's an iconic spot where, Mets hot stove used to be from Duffy's all the time. I remember going as a fan before I did any of this media stuff, and they would have the bowling nights at Duffy's where all the players would go bowling at Duffy's, and fans could just hang out and watch the players bowl and meet them. And that was something that I enjoyed doing when I was younger. And when I look at going to the park and going to the facility, get there early, go to the backfields where they're doing their workouts. This is really the closest you could get to the players. There's autograph opportunities. Most of the players will sign, and so you'll see a lot of that in spring training. You could walk the backfields towards where the minor leaguers are. You want to see the next Mets that are coming, not just the players that are currently on the roster. They're littered all over the place. They essentially walk right by you when they're going from field to field. And then, of course, taking in a spring training game or two at Clover Park is always fun. So, yeah, I think Port St. Lucie is a cool town. I think it's a growing town with more and more things to do. But, yeah, I think now is a great time to get going. And if you could go on the earlier end, I tend to like that a little better, because I did go one time. My birthday's in the middle of March, and I went one time for my birthday week with my mom. And at that point, it feels like things are kind of starting to slow down. And I had more fun when I went a little earlier in the schedule than later.
Yeah, I think the energy last year when we were there for, obviously the opener, but the couple of days leading up to that there was Mets fans everywhere. I believe Hop Life Brewing was one of the places you and I went to at night. There was a million Mets fans there hanging out, talking. And there's a couple different breweries there that are really, really good. Honestly, I'm not just saying that. They're really, really good beer, food. Like you said, it's been really built up over the years, and it's the perfect balance, because especially if you live in the Northeast, chances are you're a Mets fan. There's probably a pretty good chance you do. This winter's been awful. You get away for a couple days into really, really good weather. There's plenty places to eat and drink at night and Mets fans to hang out with. And all day, you got to get to hang out near the ballpark. And like you said, Joe, I think what people love about it is just how close you are to all the action. Like, the reality is, you go to Citi Field, you're never going to be that close. But at spring training, it's just you're right in the thick of it, and it's just a very unique atmosphere. It's a little bit more laid back, but there's also that excitement as well. Another mailbag question here. This is from Beats in Farmingdale. Thanks for the 5-star review. Soto in the third spot maximizes his protection effort. Alonso, Vientos, or Nimmo hitting before him would see better pitches, enhancing their performance. Batting Soto second negates this strategic advantage. What do you think? We've been hammering home Soto in the 2-hole, Joe. I think that also helps a guy named Francisco Lindor a lot, which is one reason I really, really like it. But there's the other side. I want Soto to get as many at-bats as he possibly can and hitting number 2. But I think it's a fair point that if you spread if it goes Lindor, I wouldn't bat Alonso second. I would bat Vientos second, personally. I would like, more rounded hitter is kind of what I'm trying to say in the second. And, we'll see if Pete can get back to that form. But how do you feel about this argument?
I'm going to be honest, Connor. I am over the protection talk. Every single spot, you need to protect this guy, and then you need to protect this guy. And what about protecting him? You can't protect every single hitter in the lineup unless you have all-stars up and down. With that said, my general thought is, and I think I said it on last week or the week before show, Francisco Lindor in the leadoff spot, Juan Soto batting second. I want those guys getting the most at-bats possible. Juan Soto's going to get on base like 43% of the time, and Lindor ahead of him. Maybe he's like a 340, 350 guy from the leadoff spot. So most of the time, you're going to have 1 to 2 guys on base for the likes of Vientos, the likes of Nimmo, the likes of Alonso, however you want to order it afterwards. It's not like the Yankees. And I think a lot of people take it because there was so much discussion around the Yankees lineup last year and needing protection for Judge and Soto because there was no Giancarlo Stanton most of the time, and there was a lot of J.D. Davis and Jahmai Jones and Austin Wells, all these guys. The Mets are in a completely different stratosphere as far as depth of lineup. So to me, while I understand the argument that's being made here in the question, I just want Lindor 1, Soto 2, and then we'll figure it out from there because the Mets lineup is incredibly deep when you just take into account bringing Alonso back and everyone that was already here.
I think sometimes we forget because he has home run moments. He's an amazing hitter. Like the beauty of Soto is that he's just always on base. And if that's going to be the case, let's comfortably say between Vientos and Alonso, there are 60 home runs in there. Now, keep in mind, Vientos hit 27 in 111 games last year. Alonso, in a down year, a career down year, hit 34 and played every game. Say Alonso lands even at 37 and Vientos lands at 28 to 32. Like the bottom line is, Joe, it's math. And I know there are people that hate statistics and analytics in baseball, but this is the most simple form. If Juan Soto is getting on base what feels like half the time, and the guys hitting after him are the 2 most likely threats in your lineup to hit home runs, that is increasing your run production significantly. So it's, I'm piggybacking off of what you said, but protection is, and I think it's a totally fine point in the question, but I do find it funny. Sometimes I'm driving and listening to sports radio. I like it the best during baseball offseason because the callers just have outrageous ideas more often than not. And a lot of them are Yankee callers. So I get a totally different perspective than the world we live in. But man, the word protection is being treated like the term franchise quarterback at this state baseball.
I mean, Connor, it's got a little out of control. These guys, especially who the Mets have, these are excellent hitters. People are not going to be walking Juan Soto intentionally to get to Mark Vientos and Pete Alonso, right? That's just, to me, I just don't see that as a too frequent outcome. But while I understand the question, I'm with you. I think Lindor 1, Soto 2, and let's rock.
All right, one more quick question here. This is from Shay something on YouTube. With the Mets spring training roster now officially released, which player do you think has a good chance to surprise some people and actually make the opening day squad? I know the second part of that question is really difficult, Joe, because, it's another reason why Jose Iglesias isn't here right now. There's just not a lot of open spots. So I'll kind of cut it for you and say, who do you think at least surprises some people and go, okay, maybe he's closer than we initially realized and might have to think more about him deeper into the year?
I want to really lean on the young players that are in camp that may not be quite the opening day options, though I think Luis Angel Acuna, it is possible, as much as it's maybe not my preferred method, it is possible that Acuna does make the opening day roster as kind of the Jose Iglesias replacement that can handle backing up shortstop, can handle maybe giving Jeff McNeil a spell at second base against left-handed pitching. So to me, when I look at this roster as a whole, though, it doesn't look like there's a whole bunch of room for competition. Like maybe the last spot in the bullpen with like Huáscar Brazoban.
That's where I wanted to go. My pick is Brazoban.
Yeah, he's a forgotten guy in a lot of ways, Connor. If you remember back when the Mets traded for him on our post-trade deadline show and we went through everything the Mets did, we were excited about Brazoban. And he obviously didn't have a great second half, but I think he has the opportunity to prove something. Danny Young showed things in spurts last year and kind of fizzled out a little towards the end, but he gets another shot here. Sean Reed-Foley, he's competing for a bullpen spot, and guys like Max Kranick and Tyler Zuber. So the bullpen, I think, is really where you're going to have the competition for maybe the last spot or two, probably one. And I think that's where it probably gets most interesting. And the position player side is just, do they go with Nick Madrigal or do they go with someone like Luis Angel Acuna? Or I guess theoretically, they could call Jose Iglesias back in a month if they need to. But I think the competition is the back end of the bullpen and the back end of the rotation. And to me, that is a sign of a very good put together baseball team, that the competition is not up and down the bullpen, up and down the lineup, up and down the rotation. It's just there's a couple spots here and there. So that just shows that David Stearns and his front office has put together a very good baseball team heading into 25.
And with Brazoban, I'm just hoping to get to the mean, right? Like, this is someone with the Marlins here in 2022, 3.09 ERA in 27 games. 2023, 4.14 ERA in 50 games. 2024 last year with the Marlins, 2.93 ERA in 20 games. And then with the Mets in 19 appearances, 5.14. He was always a double-digit strikeout over 9, K over 9 guy with the Marlins. He was 7.3 with the Mets. Like, if he finds his control and gets back, it goes somewhere in the middle between those two. What, a 3.7, 3.5 ERA guy striking out 10 over 9?
It's a good middle reliever.
That's a good middle reliever. So we'll buy back in again. That's what we do here on the Mets Pod. We will believe once again. All right. That's it for us. We are very excited, by the way, because we will be in Port St. Lucie Saturday. That is at 11 a.m. right outside of Clover Park. We're going to be with Terry Collins, which is going to be awesome for our live show at spring training. If you're coming to the game, please stop by. You can ask a question, say hi, take some pictures, hang out. It's going to be a good time. This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today, and please subscribe to the show so you never miss a show like our spring training episode that will drop sometime throughout the weekend on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel. You can leave questions on YouTube. You can leave questions in the Apple reviews. We really appreciate those 5-star reviews. So please become a subscriber everywhere you possibly can. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you in Port St. Lucie.